Welcome to The Code, your guide to health and human performance. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Fix from Physio Room, a performance-based rehab facility here in Denver. On this podcast, we're going to explore the key areas of your life that impact your overall health and wellness, from sleep hygiene and stress management to nutrition, movement, relationships, and more. We bring you conversations with industry experts and top performers to share strategies they have for cracking the code on health and human performance. Now let's get to today's show. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you're listening to this. Welcome back to this episode of The Code. Really excited to talk with our special guest today, Robb Wolf. Robb is a two-time best-selling author. If you've not heard of him, you should definitely go check him out. Two-time best-selling author of The Paleo Solution and the book Wired to Eat. It's also a newer book that I just finished reading of his, Sacred Cow. Former research biochemist and one of the world's leading experts in Paleolithic nutrition. What we're going to talk about on this show specifically, we're going to dive into LMNT. Some of you that know us at Physio Room, where I spend a lot of my time, may have tried this product. I've been using it for about a year now and absolutely love the stuff. So without any further ado, Robb, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
A huge honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, we were just sort of chatting off air. You mentioned that you and your family recently moved up to Montana, but can you just give a brief background, Robb, to the folks listening to this show, about yourself, how you got into, you're huge in the nutrition world. We're going to talk a bit about electrolytes, but tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. I just turned 50 in January. And so I noticed that my origin story just keeps stretching out more and more and get the wandering old man thing. So I'll try to be concise with it. But I've always been interested in, kind of health and human performance. My family of origin, unfortunately, was not all that healthy. Both my parents smoked. My dad drank quite a bit. My mom, now looking back, had several autoimmune related issues. And I didn't figure that out until quite late in the game. But I always kind of suspected that if I ate and moved in a way that was different than my parents and the bulk of my family, I might have some better outcomes with health. And so I ended up doing an undergrad in biochemistry, was looking at either medical school or a research track. And it was around this time, this was the mid to late 90s, that I got really, really sick. I was eating a high carb, low fat, vegan type diet. And for me, it was a really bad fit. I think for some people it works fantastically, but for me, it was a terrible fit. I ended up with ulcerative colitis so bad that I was facing either a bowel resection or immunosuppressant drugs or both. I'm about 165, 170 pounds. I'm 5'9". At the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis, I was down to 125, 130 pounds from malabsorption issues. So I was in pretty rough shape. And it was a long story how I came to this idea of ancestral health, ancestral nutrition. But that idea got on my radar. I tinkered with what we would now call kind of a low carb paleo type diet. And for me, it was nothing short of miraculous. It put my ulcerative colitis into remission and really helped to restore my health and kind of got me on this path of looking at things through this evolutionary biology kind of lens, everything from photoperiod and circadian biology, gut microbiota, the community around us. I started looking at all this stuff from that kind of hunter-gatherer perspective. And then, ironically, I ended up getting involved with this kind of weird workout around 2000, 2001 called CrossFit. Right. And my friend Dave Warner, who's a retired Navy SEAL, he and I started working out in his garage. And within about 4 months of us training, we had 15 or so people that we were training out there. And I reached out to Greg and Lauren Glassman, the founders of CrossFit. And I was like, hey, we really love the program. We're training people. We want to open a commercial gym. Can we call it CrossFit? And they were like, yes, go be achieve, do it. And so that was CrossFit North. That was the first CrossFit affiliate gym in the world. And then I had a chance to move from Seattle back down to Chico, California, where I did my undergrad. And the big difference between Chico and Seattle is in Chico, there's this fiery orb in the sky called the sun. And so I had a chance to move somewhere where there was actually some reasonable, photo period and everything. And I opened what was then the fourth CrossFit affiliate gym in the world. and then went on to write, I guess, kind of the first paleo diet book that started that genre. It made New York Times bestseller, and all kinds of good stuff came out of that. And I've done work with police, military, and fire. Subsequent to that, I was on the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Program for about 6 years, where I went and spoke to the SEAL teams, the special boat teams, and the families of those folks at their pre and post deployment events, and have been very fortunate to do just a bunch of different stuff, ranging from working with, again, elite military personnel, elite athletes, but honestly, my sweet spot is working with people similar to myself, folks who have had really complex gut and autoimmune issues and a little bit of metabolic, disease, and figuring out how to fix that. And so, although I've had a great opportunity to work with kind of, elite folks from different areas, the average schlep like myself, who just, the person that is a perfect fit for me, they've kind of run the gauntlet of standard medical intervention, but they're still not where they want to be with health. And that is kind of the center of the bullseye for me, the folks that I seem to really bond with the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, you went through a lot of stuff there that I want to unpack. I had some talking prompts, questions planned for this episode, but I think we're just going to scrap that, and we're just going to dive into some of the stuff that you just talked about. And you said, like the main person that you work with, you enjoy working with and can help, is kind of just the normal person that has issues that they're dealing with, just like you had your own issues that you went through, which changed the trajectory of how you were approaching things. And it's so funny to me that when we start talking about the medical system and nutrition and how we take care of our bodies, when we're having issues and no one can seem to figure it out, what we always end up coming back to, whether it's in a functional medicine office or a naturopathic doctor or whatever, is we come back to like the key areas of sleep, managing our stress, what do we put in our mouths, like what are we putting in our body? And it's not all of the medical medication and stuff. It's just the basic stuff that we could have been doing right all along, but we get off track sometimes, and that just throws things off. But no, that is awesome. You mentioned CrossFit. We work with a lot of CrossFit athletes in our office. We have employees that participate in CrossFit. So we are very, very fortunate to be part of that community and some of the gyms that we work with here in the Denver area. And I think the community of it, like you just said, you started and all of a sudden there's like 15 people here, and, can we turn this into a real gym and a real business, because we have people wanting to work out together?
Yeah, the CrossFit scene is fascinating to me, in that, like my second book, Wired to Eat, I broke the 4 pillars of health down into sleep or circadian biology, food, movement, and then community. And the community, I'm more of a lumper than a splitter. Like I put gut microbiota and the people that we hang out with, like that's all of our community together, everything from microbes to people. But in a well-run gym, the coach is going to talk to you about sleep and recovery. They're going to bend your ear about good nutrition and how to properly fuel yourself. Just as a side note too, something that I really liked about CrossFit is we had no disordered eating in the gym, because although people wanted to be lean and they wanted to look good and everything, when you write people's name on the board and you have the prospect of coming in dead last, or like seeing where you rank on a workout, we would have like in particular women who would be motoring along and they're doing great, and then they start sliding down the leaderboard, and I'm like, what's going on with you? And you do a little bit of poking around, they're like, well, I've been skipping meals because I want to look better or whatever. And I'm like, listen, do you want Jenny to keep kicking your ass in the workout? And the woman is basically like, fuck no. I'm like, okay, well, let's eat properly. And once you get to where you can do 20 pull-ups and you can standing press your body weight, and you can, then you're going to have the physique you want. And it was really cool in that regard. Like, I think that there's a lot of stuff that could be improved with CrossFit, like the onboarding and appropriate dose and all that stuff. But one of the really cool things is the fact that it is performance first, aesthetics second. I just didn't see the ubiquity of disordered eating, and you had a really easy leverage to handle that in the gym. Whereas when I did more just straight up like body composition kind of physique work with people. It was super easy for people to spin out, both men and women, and get into this kind of disordered eating. So I really appreciated the power of that kind of performance oriented piece. And then, you've got that exercise, you've got that community. We opened our gym a couple of years before the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. We opened in 2004. And so what was interesting there is we had people who had lost almost everything. They were unemployed, maybe lost a house, lots of stuff. They didn't cancel their gym membership. And what they found was that being in the gym and hustling, like somebody somewhere knew someone that they could do something. And so they would find some work, or they would find another career path and stuff like that. And so we just found the social connections within the gym like invaluable. Like you just couldn't replicate that anywhere else. And so it was interesting in this one-stop shop, and the fact that you spent 3 to 5 hours a week with these people, depending on how often they came in, like there was a huge opportunity to have a massive impact on their lives. And I'm glad that I didn't end up continuing with regular medical school, because I think I would have hated that. Like the type of medicine I wanted to practice is the gym. Like that's definitely what worked for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you and I have something in common there. I mean, our clinic at Physio Room, very performance based. Like, obviously we're talking about getting people's symptoms to improve when they come in with knee pain, but it's not about the knee pain. It's about the things that they want to do. It's about the squats that they want to perform. It's about the hiking or the biking or the whatever. It's about the performance. And through that gym community, honestly, is how we ended up having this conversation. So, one of our offices here is inside of a gym, Lion's Den, Strength, Mobility, and Performance. And their owner, Tristan, and his wife, Haley, they two own the gym. Through the product Element is how we ended up getting connected with you. So, Tristan is big into, the ancestral diet. I don't like to use the word diet, but eating approach, lifestyle approach. And he's a big time runner. So he lifts, he runs marathons. So he's always talking about getting adequate electrolytes in. So he starts using this product called LMNT. I see him pouring little packets into his water. So of course I'm asking him, hey, what do you got there? So he starts telling me about it. And then they start carrying it in the gym, sharing it with their clientele, sharing it with their staff. And then we wanted to do the same thing, because after I had started using it for a few weeks, I was like, wow, I like this stuff better than a lot of the other things that I've tried. And I've tried a lot of things. But like you said, a good coach, or in a good gym, the owners or the coaches are going to be talking to their members about more than just the workout. It's going to be about your sleep, about how you're fueling, because how you're fueling is so important, and that's going to directly impact your performance. So sort of like going down that rabbit hole, how did you get involved with LMNT? Where did LMNT come from? Like, what's the background of it? And then let's start jamming a little bit about that.
Yeah, that is kind of a long story, and I'll try to keep it brief. But because of my gut issues, I've eaten kind of a low carb, ketogenic diet for like 23 years now. Like I'll deviate a little here and there, but I mean, I have celiac, so I can't play with gluten. Like the risk reward deal is just not there at all. And I find that I just generally do a little bit better on lower carb. Okay. But the physical activity I tend to do, I have a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and the strength training that I like to do tends to be a little bit more on the higher intensity side. The bugger is that a low carb diet doesn't beautifully fuel a glycolytic higher intensity type sports. Like it's very much like, at odds with each other. And I had tinkered for the last 20, some odd years with, do I do some pre-workout carbs? Do I do some post-workout carbs? But I just found it difficult to make things work. Like if I ate enough to improve my performance, then I started getting some gut issues. And it was just kind of a weird thing. And I kept fiddling with that though. And then I found these two guys, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villasenor, who were the founders of a program called Keto Gains. And it's this online ketogenic diet boot camp where they help people affect these body composition changes. And it's kind of jaw-dropping. Like, it's amazing the success stories you saw from folks when I started looking at it, specifically on body composition. But then I started noticing that they had, in particular, women who were competing at really high levels in like CrossFit and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and they were eating ostensibly this kind of lower carb diet. I'm like, what the heck's going on with these guys? So I kind of stalked Tyler and Luis and started hanging out with them, and then, you know, shook them down to look at what I was doing and gave them my kind of meal plan and everything. And they're like, oh, your protein, carbs, fat look fine. That all looks good. But we suspect that you're deficient in electrolytes, specifically sodium. And me being a biochemist, I was like, oh, no, I'm good. Like, my electrolytes are on point. You know, I salt my food. I'm totally good. And I'm sure that at this stage of the game, they had heard this 10,000 times, if not 100,000 times. And they probably eye rolled so hard that their head practically fell off of their shoulders, but they're kind people, and they didn't kick me out of their lives. And it took me another year of just flailing and floundering. But eventually they were like, listen, man, the problem, I guarantee you, is inadequate electrolytes, specifically sodium.
Yeah.
Weigh and measure everything that you're doing, including your electrolyte intake and all the salt you put on your food. And we want you at least 5 grams of sodium per day, was kind of what the benchmark was. I was at less than 2 grams of sodium per day. And it was as simple as they were like, okay, so drink some pickle juice, like take like 6 ounces of pickle juice, drink it, and go do your next workout.
Right. I
did it, and it was like magic happened. I just couldn't even believe it. I was like, oh my God, you know, like I had that lower end gear that just didn't seem to exist when I've been eating this lower carb diet. And when you dig into the kind of physiology behind it, when we are eating a higher carb intake, our insulin levels tend to be higher. Insulin fosters the production of this hormone called aldosterone, and aldosterone causes us to retain sodium. When we retain sodium, we retain fluid balance and whatnot. And the opposite of that happens when we are either fasting or eating a low carb diet. We tend to experience this thing called the natriuresis of fasting, where we lose sodium and we lose water. And it's really it's a non-trivial challenge to stay on top of it. And it's one of the things that within diet circles, the folks advocating for low carb diets, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, had just missed entirely the need for ramping up sodium intake for folks. And this is true even when people just go from like a highly processed diet, which is where folks get 80% of the sodium that they consume. Only 5% of the sodium that people consume comes from like the salt shaker at the dinner table. Like, that is almost a laughable contribution to this whole story. And so if somebody just shifts their diet from like a highly processed diet to a minimally processed diet, they're going to dramatically reduce their glycemic intake, which will cause them to retain sodium less, and they're going to consume less sodium unless they really actively, you know, take some work to fix that. So that was all kind of the genesis of this thing, of me realizing that sodium and electrolytes are this big deal. Tyler and Luis had known this for like 10 years, but I was late to the game on this. But I was like, man, when I look at the folks that we collectively are working with, and my folks in particular, all of these issues, you know, like exercise performance, sleep issues, kind of like thyroid, HPTA axis dysregulation. I'm like, this is all inadequate sodium intake, you know, and they're like, yeah, it's probably the case in the vast majority of these people. So we knew that we needed to get information out to people to help them. And so we put together this thing called KetoAid, which was basically how to mix your own electrolyte drink at home. And it was this much table salt, this much potassium chloride from no salt, some magnesium citrate, lemon juice, stevia, shake it up, you know, and go. And we were so unsophisticated, like we didn't even use it as like an email, you know, funnel or anything. We just put it up. It was like, you know,
here you
use
go.
This thing. Yeah, here you go. And within about 6 months, we had 500,000 downloads of this thing.
Wow. Yeah,
like, that's quick. Crazy. Yeah. And then we started getting which was cool. It was very validating. And we started getting lots of feedback like, oh my God, like all these problems that I've had from the way I've been eating are improved. I feel way better. I have that low gear. My sleep is improved, all this stuff. But there was one complaint that we had, which was people, when they were traveling, they're going through TSA and their 3 bags of white powder were like
That's right.
a problem, you know? And so these folks that were benefiting from this free downloadable guide were like, hey, why don't you guys make a convenient product that we could use, you know, take with us and everything. And that was the whole genesis of this. Like there was no like, you know, mustache twisting, like, oh man, we're going to create this this electrolyte product. But what was kind of cool about all of this is that I went into all of this with a decent background in biochemistry and physiology, but I didn't have strong predilection one way or the other with regards to formulation and all that type of stuff. And so when I started looking at how we might formulate this thing, what we did is we looked at the diets of about 300 people that were in the Keto Gains program. They were tracking all their macros through chronometer, so very detailed information. And we looked at how much calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium that these folks were getting on like a whole food, minimally processed diet, which was what our goal was for people. People were great on calcium. They were a little deficient in magnesium, more deficient in potassium, and then just woefully deficient in sodium. And that was the way that we formulated the product. It was a gram of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and then 60 milligrams of magnesium. And what's been kind of funny as we've progressed along the way, we've had lots of people say, oh, you totally screwed up the formula. I'm like, go do it, man. Like jump in, like make it better, you know? Right. And I don't know that I would say that it's perfect, because perfect, you know, there's all kinds of different situations and all that stuff, but it's pretty damn good. And it's very different than what most of the other products represent. Folks get kind of wrapped around the axle of like the potassium intake, which is absolutely critically important, but we are also like unrelenting in telling people you need to eat a minimally processed diet so that you get the potassium from your food. And you know that, so this thing literally is supplemental to the whole story, not the thing that you should go to try to fill all the gaps of a shitty diet. And you know, I think we are one of, if not the fastest growing health and wellness company in the last couple of years. Like we're incredibly fortunate. I would have never, ever in my life predicted that, when you think about the ubiquity of like electrolyte products and energy drinks and everything. Like when God honest truth is that when we formulated LMNT, we came out with a citrus and some spicy flavors, and those were designed so that if it failed as an electrolyte product, we were going to pivot and then sell it as like a drink mixer for like margaritas and stuff like that. Because I just wasn't sure. I had a feeling it might do really well, but I was also like, this is either going to go great or it's going to be like a plane into a mountainside. So you know, and if you can spin up a good drink base like that, that's usually pretty successful. So now we get to do both. So
I think you'll be happy to hear that I've used LMNT in all of those capacities in my life. My wife is a huge margarita fan, and having a little bit of that spicy salt in there just makes it feel a little bit better for you, right? So
pretty legit. Yeah.
I've actually got a little bit right here. So I'm drinking some coffee, but we've got a mint chocolate element in the coffee, and that's my morning routine now. Because like you said, you know, generally speaking, who this product is like sort of geared towards is someone who's already hopefully eating a minimally processed whole food based diet. And like you mentioned, 80% of the sodium that we get, the typical, you know, American diet gets, is from that highly processed food. It's not coming from, you know, you're pouring teaspoons of salt onto your plate every night at dinner. And a lot of those people are deficient in these electrolytes. That's who this is geared towards. And I would say for myself, you know, going through like my own challenges, that's exactly what happened to me. Why I started taking an electrolyte supplement in the first place is twice in my life, I've had to, once was just like, you know, in my pediatrician's office when I was in high school, And then the second time was more, in my late 20s, mid to late 20s, when I was in the hospital because of hydration and electrolyte issues. So, the first story in high school, I'm in, the middle of my freshman year of wrestling season, and I'm trying to like cut some weight type of thing. I'm drinking plenty of water and just flushing myself out, right? Like trying to eat a whole food, minimally processed diet, trying to eat like a low calorie diet too, because I'm trying to like skim a few pounds, but I wasn't supplementing with anything. And when I was, it was a bottle of Gatorade here and there, which as I learned more about nutrition, well, that's not probably the best way to go about things if you're trying to lose weight.
Right.
And then, the same thing happened later in my life. I'm pushing myself. I'm eating relatively healthy diet and of the non-processed stuff, but I'm not adding sodium to my food and things because all of the information that I've been like drilled into my brain growing up is, we have too much sodium, where so many people have high blood pressure, all this stuff like, oh, you should avoid the salt. Well, then I wound up in the hospital with an IV in my arm, pumping me full of electrolytes because I was way, way deficient. So I started taking this electrolyte supplement. It's probably been like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago now, every single day. Haven't had an issue since.
Yeah.
So it's just crazy.
One of the interesting things when I was doing my diligence getting into all this, I just started looking around it like, so one thing is kind of the medical side of like the hypertension and blood pressure, and I'll try to remember to circle back to that. But I was really looking at like sodium intake, electrolyte intake, and athletic performance. And what was kind of shocking, and Tim Noakes, Professor Tim Noakes, wrote this amazing book called Waterlogged, which was looking at the overhydration of athletes that has happened over the last 30 years. And there was this kind of weird thing that happened when I was a kid. Like I said, I turned 50 the beginning of this year. When I was a kid, we were still right on the cusp of our football coaches would tell us to take a salt tablet and kind of chew on that and then sip water per our need, our thirst mechanism. And it worked great. It actually worked really, really well. And then Gatorade came on. And just as an aside, when Gatorade was first released, we had a couple of friends go to the Gatorade museum there at Florida State University and everything. When Gatorade first came out, it had 1 gram of sodium per serving. Like it was very, very different than what it is now. So it was actually, when you look back, they were actually like really on point with the stuff that they were doing. And then it's kind of gotten, tweaked over time. But when I really poked around, like there's this great report that makes the case that there is no example in the literature of people allowing themselves to die from dehydration. Like the only people who die from dehydration, specifically inadequate bodily fluid, is if they're like trapped in a mine cave in, or they get lost in the wilderness or something like that. But
they don't have access.
They just don't have access. But there are thousands of people that have died from hyponatremia, from over consuming water, diluting their sodium. And like every single year, like every like Spartan race, marathon, like the people end up over consuming water without adequate electrolytes, and they get hospitalized and occasionally they die. It's improving a little bit because the idea of hydration is definitely making its way to people much more consistently. But it was a fascinating eye-opener that the real danger there is not under consuming water, it's over consuming it, particularly in the context of inadequate electrolytes. Like it is a quick way to kill someone. And like fraternity hazing and stuff like that, where they have people drink huge amounts of water, like lots of people have died from that type of stuff. So like that was an interesting side of this, that you could easily make the case that it's more dangerous to under consume sodium and over consume water than the flip side, which seems kind of crazy when you look at all the like, health magazines at the checkout counter, and it's, the 8 ounce glasses of water a day and all that type of stuff. The interesting thing on the diet or the diet blood pressure side of things, and I had been savvy to this for a long time, but there's definitely a relationship between blood pressure and sodium. So blood pressure is driven in large part by how much sodium we retain. But the thing is that when folks with hypertension, high blood pressure have been put on low carb or low sodium diets, their blood pressure doesn't really go down. It goes down a little bit, but it's not like this really profound change. And so there was definitely, somebody who is insulin resistant and hypertensive, you're not doing them a favor by giving them more salt, but you're also not really fixing the underlying problem by restricting salt. And part of the problem with that is that we store salt in our bones. So even somebody on a low salt diet, if they are still insulin resistant, they'll pull sodium out of their bones, still have high blood pressure. And then as they pull the sodium out of their bones, they're also leaching calcium out of their bones. So it's maybe fostering osteoporosis and all that type of stuff. And
what was,
just crazy across the board was that if somebody's hypertensive, they need to reduce their glycemic load. Like they need to reduce the total amount of calories and really look at like the amount and type of carbohydrate that they're eating. And if we can modify that, and it doesn't have to be a ketogenic diet, but just basically a less processed, lower glycemic load diet is going to work miracles for blood pressure for the vast majority of people. And then the ironic thing there is once you are not like bloating up like a tick from water retention from insulin resistance, now you actually need to supplement with sodium, particularly if you're active, because you're just not holding on to it the same way.
Yeah. And I love that because, the general theme, it sounds like that you're talking about is, if we start talking about hypertension and sodium is, restricting the sodium isn't really addressing the root cause of why they have that condition in the first place. And addressing the root cause is, we keep coming back to this, like LMNT is not there, or any electrolyte supplement for that matter. You can't supplement your way out of a shitty diet, right? Or out of a shitty way that you're going about living your life. That's not what it's for. It's there to supplement and be an add-on to an already proper way to like fuel yourself with whole food and eating a proper diet. So, and that's basically what you're saying is like, that's not the root cause of the issue. Let's address the root cause. It's not the overconsumption of sodium. And then we may find out that the person actually needs to supplement more if they actually address the issue. So and reason I wanted you to touch on that, and I appreciate you for doing that, is when we introduce this to clients in the office, that's a lot of times the first question that we get, because as I describe it to people, I make sure to let them know like, hey, this is going to be more salty than probably a lot of the other things that you've tried, but that's not a bad thing because, you already told me, they told me what type of diet they're eating and whatnot. I'm like, you probably need this. You're sweating a lot. You're pushing yourself. You probably need more than what you're actually getting, unless you tell me you are loading up, all of your food with salt. And usually the answer is no. But that's people's first concern is like, whoa, isn't that too much? Isn't that too much salt for me to have? And we sort of start to try and unravel that conversation. So I think that'll be good for people to hear. So let's just take like a slight step back because I don't want to assume that everybody listening to this recording is going to know exactly like what is the purpose in our body from like an exercise standpoint or just a function standpoint. Like, why do we need electrolytes in the first place? Like, what do they do in our body? Like, I, for the most part, know the answer, but I don't know that everybody really knows like what's so important about electrolytes in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's funny. This was kind of another like reawakening for me because I've done innumerable like, classes where you learn the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, and a carbohydrate goes through this metabolic pathway and how energy is produced. And it's easy though to lose appreciation. Like every single nerve impulse, muscle contraction, every aspect of life that we experience is driven by sodium potassium pumps. Like this is the way that energy is produced in virtually all of living organisms, whether single-celled or multicellular is creating these ion gradients. And like within our bodies, we tend to have more sodium outside of cells and more potassium inside of cells. And when those, it's almost like thinking about water behind a dam. And when that water goes through the dam, you can harness that energy. And part of the way that we make our energy is creating these gradients of sodium and potassium. And then when they normalize, it can produce action potentials, which is the contraction of muscles or the firing of nerves. So I mean, like literally every single thing that we do biologically is largely driven by these electrolyte-based sodium potassium pumps, right, at kind of a root level. And this is also where, you know, people usually only start thinking about electrolytes once we get into like a cramping scenario or you know, some of these other gnarlier health considerations. But it's fairly obvious at this point that the first signs of electrolyte imbalance are diminished fine motor skill, kind of brain fog and neurological fatigue. So there's minutes or hours of diminished, you know, kind of suboptimal performance leading up into that overt thing where like you get your toe cramp or your calf cramp or something. By the time you're cramping from electrolyte insufficiency, you're really far down the path to being kind of hosed. Like there was a lot, if you're concerned about performance, like you're playing tennis, there was a lot of tennis playing that you did. It was super suboptimal because the sodium potassium levels in your body were not appropriate to make everything work the way that it should. So that's why, you know, it literally the most fundamental level of life, that is where, you know, electrolytes play their key role. This maybe gets a little far out into the weeds, but I think people with a little bit of a medical or science background would appreciate it. But the only things that the most tightly regulated processes in our bodies are pH and electrolyte. Blood sugar is very important, but you can have almost orders of magnitude changes in the amount of blood sugar before, you know, the body will really freak out. But if pH goes up or down by just a little bit, if electrolytes go up or down by just a little bit, like you can get sick or die from that process. So it's the tight regulation tells me that it's really important, very, very critical to stay on top of that. And we see this manifest, you know, with a host of different health issues. But the subtler parts are, I think, what people are kind of battling most of the time. Most people aren't hospitalized because of low electrolyte status and whatnot, but they may be feeling like garbage all frequently. Their sleep may be disturbed, difficulty falling asleep, artificially elevated heart rate, like all these different things from inadequate electrolyte intake. And I see this more and more and more, kind of the higher the activity level that the person kind of participates in.
Yeah. And, you know, out here in Colorado, I'm sure the same for you where you live, a lot of endurance athletes, a lot of people that are really pushing their body. And maybe they're suffering from, you know, things like cramping. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're just in that suboptimal performance realm, which I think so many people find themselves in, where they don't really necessarily think too much of it, because I think the way that our whole society is like, we don't really address a problem until it is like literally smacking us in the face. We're having this like V8 moment and you're forced to take action. But if we can move the needle a little bit more towards the like, hey, rather than like reacting to a problem, let's try to prevent that problem from happening in the first place. But a lot of times people don't know that until like you said, when you were stalking Tyler and Luis, you were like, no, I'm doing fine with this, until they sort of like prove to you like, no, this is the issue. And until you actually tried it, you know, a year later, then you started to see the gains in performance. And you had mentioned, you know, pre-workout supplements and things like that's kind of how I use this product is, you know, I've never been one to like really enjoy pre-workouts. Like naturally I'm pretty high energy and whatnot, you know, I'll have some caffeine and whatnot, but I don't feel like I need caffeine. I'm pretty jazzed up to work out as it is. But, you know, if I'm not hydrated, if I'm under fueled from an electrolyte standpoint, I'm going to feel that like diminishing returns of the performance. And a lot of times the pre-workout is, you know, just putting some salt in some water or just taking a packet of LMNT or whatever. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. So literally, like you mentioned, basically every function of our body is fueled by electrolytes. The one we think of the most is probably the muscle function, the movement, the muscle contractions. When we're lacking, maybe you get things like cramping. But like you alluded to, if you're at that point, you're already way down the path of being under on your electrolyte balance.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, the human body is so wild. Like you mentioned, blood sugar compared to blood glucose compared to electrolytes. If something is like tightly monitored in our body with how great our body is at like buffering issues, that's clearly very important, right? If we need to be in this very fine window, and if it's kind of like our temperature in our body, right? Like temperature is very, very finely monitored too. If we're a couple degrees too high, a couple of degrees too low, our body starts having all sorts of issues. Well, pH balance and electrolytes are kind of the same way.
Yeah. And it was just kind of an interesting eye opener to me when I started looking at what are the things that have the tightest regulatory bounds on them, before things go sideways for us. Yeah.
The human body wouldn't have evolved the way that it did if it didn't monitor certain things. So
right.
That's a great conversation that we just kind of went down. Aside from just electrolytes, again, I would love for you to just kind of summarize. We're talking a lot about coming back to the root cause of issues. First and foremost, you want to make sure you're eating a healthful, whole food based diet. And you talk a lot about whether it's low carb or paleo is kind of like what works for you, or more specifically, eating like this ancestral type of diet. And there's so many different words out there. There's a lot of people are doing vegetarian and vegan and paleo and keto and all different things. And what we know is some things work better for some people than others. And, everyone has their own optimal balance for their body. But like, if someone was interested in following an ancestral or a paleo type of diet, like generally speaking, what does that mean?
Man, even
and I'm opening up a big box here.
Where I've tried to go even a step maybe simpler than that is just looking at nutrient density.
Yeah.
This is kind of, I think, where the rubber hits the road. And nutrient density is just this idea of getting the most nutrition, like vitamins, minerals, essential nutrients per calorie that we could
best bang for your buck.
Yeah. Like if we were investing money, you get a 10% return instead of a 5% return,
Sure.
And when we start thinking about nutrient density, it's interesting the things that are winners and losers in that. Seafood, organ meats, leaner cuts of ruminant meats, like cows and sheep and goats and stuff like that. Very, very good. Herbs and spices, very good. Mm-hmm. Fruits are pretty good. Vegetables are okay. They're okay, but it kind of varies. Like kale actually isn't like the rock star that you would think it is. Things like endive and things like that are much better. Root vegetables are okay. Things that are pretty poor are interestingly like grains and legumes. They're pretty low down the list. Like you end up needing to eat a remarkable amount of calories in that situation to get the same just kind of like protein content, to say nothing of like the rest of the nutrients. And then we have this other side of things. So you have the basic like nutrient density, like how much vitamins, minerals, essential nutrients are in the food. Mm-hmm. But then any given food, depending on how it's prepared and what things are in it, it may be more or less accessible to our bodies. So like there was a really fascinating study where they fed folks traditionally milled corn tortillas with meat in the basically the taco type deal. But corn has a lot of phytic acid. It's a metal sequestering organic acid that basically bonds to zinc and iron and different ionic metals that we would have in our diet. And what was interesting is you could eat a meal that was rich in zinc and magnesium, these things that usually people are deficient in, And that corn tortilla base had so much phytic acid in it that people absorbed almost none of the minerals in it, which was kind of crazy. So this is where kind of that paleo diet perspective, because it looked a lot at like anti-nutrients and immunogenic products, like dairy can cause inflammatory responses for some people, the protein, not necessarily the sugar and whatnot. Different plants like nightshades, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants. And again, like the people can turn into religious zealots around this stuff where they're like,
Sure.
never eat a tomato. And it's like, no, that's not the thing. Like if you're having if you've otherwise buttoned up a lot of your life, but you're still like having some gut issues or like some joint pain or systemic inflammation, then we have some more layers that we can kind of peel on this stuff. But I think that the nutrient density piece with an eye towards adequate protein intake, like that's really where good, effective nutrition kind of lies. Getting about 1 gram of protein per pound of lean body mass up to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, I think is a good window that people can operate from. The dense protein sources are very satiating. Like it's difficult to overeat those things, and we tend not to overeat other stuff.
Yeah.
If we undereat protein, we have a tendency to overeat everything else. And it's this concept called the protein leverage hypothesis, which I think is pretty useful for helping people to kind of dial this stuff in. And as part of our Healthy Rebellion community, we do these resets 3 times a year where we work on sleep and food and exercise. And usually body composition is one of the main things that folks want to work on.
Yeah.
And I tell you, we never, ever, ever work with people who have body composition goals who are eating adequate protein. They're always under eating protein. Like they're never on point with protein. Like, oh, I'm still just overeating. Like they're always under eating protein. And then it usually leads into other, kind of problematic dietary choices.
Yeah, totally. And, it's so interesting, like sort of hearing you say that. I was having a conversation with another gym owner here in town, and they were giving kind of a talk to their gym community about nutrition. It was very much a discussion about like, what are the key points that we need to hit with nutrition? And it's all the same stuff you're talking about, right? It's like eat whole food, get adequate protein intake, drink mostly water, like these types of things. And my wife has, over the last several years, been involved in the aesthetic, sport, fitness, bodybuilding type of realm. And that's a consistent theme. All of the competitors that are like tracking their macronutrients, the most important one that they want to make sure they hit is protein, right? And they're not having body composition issues. In fact, they're like among the most, from an aesthetic standpoint and a body composition standpoint, some of the most fit people there are. Right. And it just all comes back down like to that protein. But what I would love for you to touch on, because I think a lot of the clients that we end up working with, a lot of the people that'll probably listen to this podcast, they're probably getting closer to the amount that you're talking about, like a gram of protein per pound of body mass and whatnot. But I still think there's, from other individuals that I talk to, maybe ones that aren't quite as involved in the fitness lifestyle and fitness industry, still are struggling with this myth that's out there that eating too much protein is bad for our body. Like it's going to cause our kidneys to shut down or some other organs in our body and whatnot. And I still hear that sometimes. So what would you say to someone who's like has those type of concerns? Because I know you're someone that can speak to that.
Yeah, man. So that was where the book Sacred Cow, and also we have a film, Sacred Cow. That book looks at the health, environmental, and ethical considerations of a meat-inclusive food system. So also we might as well throw like all the climate change concerns that people have around like, greenhouse gas emissions and all this stuff. And
great book too.
Thank you.
I thought it was awesome. It got recommended to me, and it was because, I kind of did the same thing as you. There was a short period of time where I started to eat a little bit more of a vegan based diet. And I probably was what I call like 95% vegan for about a 4-month time period. And though I was feeling good, like generally, like I felt better. I think looking back on it, because I don't do that anymore, I think it was just because I would cut out a lot of the processed stuff. right? I was
Right.
eating a more whole food diet. However, I did feel like what you said is I was having to eat a lot more calories to feel satiated and to like
Yeah.
feel adequately full and have enough energy and whatnot. So I was just eating more food, but it was whole food. So that's
Right.
probably the part that was making me feel good. I opted to, move back the other way. And I feel great now because I'm still eating a generally whole food based diet. Of course, I, don't like strongly restrict things. I have treats every now and then, but I feel just as good as I felt then, still including meat in my diet. So
Right. Yeah. And so what are the big meat, health concerns? It's usually kind of vegan type doctors, and they'll say meat causes cancer, meat causes heart disease, meat causes type 2 diabetes. And they'll do these meat accelerates aging, like mTOR, insulin like growth factors, all these things. Like it's interesting within ketogenic diet circles, there's a group of people that are as afraid of protein as like raw vegans are afraid of protein. It's kind of crazy, but the literature on this stuff, or the support for this, comes from epidemiological literature that is based around food frequency questionnaires. It's basically they ask people to recall what they've eaten, and then they correlate this with, potential disease process. And these studies have been really soundly criticized in that people lie in the food frequency questionnaires. Like they kind of report what they think that the interviewers, wants to hear.
Yeah. Right.
If you've ever watched some of these true crime programs where there's videotape of an event that happened, and then there's a group of people that saw the event, but then you see what their recollections of the event are, it's as if the people were not even there. Like it's so random. It doesn't match. So like it's terrible. These studies have been criticized to the point that some very smart, influential people have made the case that like they shouldn't be funded anymore. Like they're not really answering any questions. It creates a lot of confusion. And there's some interesting counterpoints to this. Like the country with the longest lifespan on the planet also happens to be the one with the largest meat consumption, which is Hong Kong. And it's like, it's a stepwise pattern. And there's some other interesting data that has emerged over time, which goes totally counter to like the China study claims. As meat consumption has increased globally within developing countries, lifespan has increased. Like people are better fed and have higher nutritional status, and they've subsequently lived longer. The protein causes kidney damage. There's absolutely nothing that supports that. If you already have kidney damage, then a higher protein intake can degrade kidney function, possibly a higher rate. But the interesting thing with that is that so much of the main causes of kidney damage, like polycystic kidney disease and whatnot, is driven from insulin resistance and high blood glucose levels. So this is a situation where because the elevated glucose content of the blood, they create these things called AGEs, advanced glycation end products, where it literally like caramelizes the proteins of our body, and it'll damage the kidneys. It makes us go blind faster. It damages the brain. Like this is why type 2 diabetics are aging about a third faster than a normal euglycemic individual. Like they're just, oxidative stress, all this stuff. It's really terrible. But what's interesting about that is the recommendation for these kidney patients is low protein, higher carb diet, which isn't really addressing the problem. And if you do a little bit of poking around and you look at like a modest protein ketogenic diet, those ketone bodies actually seem to recover and foster regrowth of the kidney material that has been damaged over the course of time. Doesn't fix everybody, doesn't help all situations, but it's as contrary to the kind of dominant narrative as you could get. And I'm trying to think of some of the other stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of really compelling messaging around this idea that animal products are giving you cancer and accelerating aging. And,
Yeah.
there was the Game Changers, vegan documentary where
Right.
dudes can't get boners and all this stuff. And the interesting thing is it's very easy on that kind of pro-vegan side of things to just do this list, like meat causes cancer, meat gives you heart disease, meat makes you infertile. And you just do this long list. It accelerates climate change, it's unethical. And then to address any of that is a mini PhD thesis at every single step.
Right.
Because credibly, I can't just say, no, that's wrong, and then leave it at that. Like, I've actually got to explain it. The interesting thing is these guys don't really explain it. They just throw it out there. They'll flash like the image of a research paper, and then that's it. And, mainstream media, social media, academia, by and large, it accepts what they're selling. But then people like me will get in and do like a line by line takedown of what the claims are. And it's like, okay, this is the material they've cited. Here's what this thing actually says. Here are all these counterpoints to it. And there you go. Yeah. So it's,
Yeah, no, and I love that, being someone who, went to school through like a science-based program, at the end of the day, what we're sort of touching on and talking about here is like, what are the sources that the information is coming from? Like, does the research actually support these things? And, what I love to do is find, whether it's a medical provider or just a friend or whatever, is people who, whether they feel strongly one way or another way, they're open-minded to hearing another person's point of view. Whether or not that changes their opinion, that's fine. But what really frustrates me is when someone is just so close-minded about like what it is that they believe in, where they won't even hear any other options, even when the other information is presented with like very thorough research backing or whatever. It's like, I just love when people are open-minded to different ideas. Like, I think that's kind of how you are. Obviously, you've gone through, like, you've challenged what you thought you knew by learning more and finding out more information and talking with other really, really smart people. Kind of how you got down the element route. And, what we thought we knew 50 years ago is not necessarily what we know today. And, 50 years from now, we're going to probably know something different.
Hopefully we've improved on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just being like a voracious learner is awesome, because, if you can just challenge what you think, or just live by this mindset of like, I don't know a lot. There's a lot more that I don't know than what I do know, whether that's around nutrition or whether it's climate change or electrolytes or whatever we're talking about.
Yeah, and not to politicize this thing, but I will throw this out there because I think it's really important. We've reached a point within media, social media, kind of the zeitgeist that we exist in, where it's difficult, bordering on impossible, to raise questions around what the dominant narrative is. So the book Sacred Cow calls into question this idea that animal husbandry is this massive contributor to climate change. And right out of the gate, we cite information that, like, there have been claims from these kind of World Economic Forum, WHO-backed organizations that say that 70% of greenhouse gas emissions come from animal husbandry. It's patently false. It's more like 2 to 3%, right, as a beginning. But what happens is this stuff is said, it goes out, it's kind of like peeing in a pool, you never get it back out.
Yep.
There's no there's no like strong work to undo what's been done. Like, these people can be very sloppy, seemingly intentionally, on the front end. And then now you can still, it's pretty easy to cruise around Twitter and find credible looking people citing numbers like, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions come from animal husbandry, which is totally false. And then there's this next layer to it that, like, particularly with grazing animals, the methane and the carbon dioxide they are releasing was part of a plant that plant pulled the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to grow. It's part of a carbon cycle. So we are still at a spot where we generally are able to have this conversation around this stuff, but we've been in these weird situations where me simply saying, hey, we need to have a nuanced discussion around climate change. I've had people say, well, you must be a climate change denier then. And I'm like, no, I understand solar radiation, polar gases absorb radiation that can heat the planet. Venus is a great example of this. It's 800 degrees on the surface. I get it. What I'm saying is there's a bunch of nuance to it that we need to discuss, because it is an important topic and we should get it right. It's kind of like if one is performing neurosurgery, you don't want to wear oven mitts doing that. You want the finest motor skills you can possibly get. And one of the things that I would just beg your listeners to think about and to really advocate for is we need to create the space for people to push back against the dominant narrative. And sometimes they're going to be wrong. Oftentimes they're going to be wrong, but once we have decided that we have it all figured out, we have literally died as a culture. Like that is the end of the development of exploring truth. That was kind of my thing when I said, hopefully 50 years from now, we know more than what we did. That hasn't always been the case throughout history. We've had dark ages and we've had points where we go backwards because ideology is such that you can't question authority. And we're at this weird spot where that is kind of becoming the norm, where people are remarkably comfortable with like, well, I just don't agree with this person and I think that this is right and they should be silenced. And there should be someone monitoring Twitter, Facebook, whatever. And it is absolutely horrifying to me how short-sighted this is and how incredibly dangerous this is. But it seems to be folks are remarkably comfortable with censoring their peers, and they always think, this is one thing that I'll mention from within the CrossFit circles. CrossFit had some really weird dysfunction with shooting people down who were critical of the methodology, and and maybe correctly, maybe incorrectly. But what ended up happening is that the best thinkers within CrossFit left, and then you had literally a brain vacuum there. And then it's like the rogue games and most of the really good thinking around CrossFit type training doesn't come from CrossFit HQ itself anymore. It comes from everybody peripheral to it who kind of got chased out. And that would be a really terrible thing to do for us to hammer our biomedical academics and whatnot in such a way that they just cease researching things like climate change and whatnot, because it's too dangerous for their career. And
I love that. And that, in a way, that's kind of where this podcast came from. And I think the part that you just mentioned, like, you hope the listeners, pay attention to this, is like, we want people to challenge the status quo and not just like be okay with, just what they've been told. Be willing to investigate, be really curious about things, have intelligent discussions around things, and be advocates for their own health. Right. And that, in a way, that's kind of where this podcast came from. And, why we want to talk to people like you and the other folks that we've had and will have on this show. But Rob, this has been fun. I know, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you've got other things to do, but I think we touched on a lot of cool things, from, exercise to nutrition to electrolytes to, even starting to talk about climate change and whatnot.
Yeah.
If people want to find out more about you, I want to make sure I sort of plug your show here. You guys have got a program called Healthy Rebellion Radio. Is that right?
Yep.
What do you guys talk about on that show? If you could give the listeners kind of a summary if they wanted to come check you guys out on there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a Q&A program mainly, where listeners will write in questions and we try to answer those to the best of our ability, a host of different health topics, but I mean sleep, food, training, community, gut microbiome stuff. Definitely, I spend a fair amount of bandwidth to this kind of climate change, sustainable food systems kind of area, which has almost been career suicide for me. But I have I have 7 and 9-year-old daughters, and I do think that it behooves us to get this part of the story right, and so I do devote a fair amount of time to trying to unpack that topic and have some open discussions. RobbWolf.com is kind of my main hub. I have a Substack, robbwolf.substack.com. In theory, I'm on social media, but I'm not there. I post stuff. I don't interact with people there. On my Substack, I interact with people. At the Healthy Rebellion, I interact with people, but I'm torn as to whether or not I'm actually worsening our world by even having like an Instagram and a Twitter account and stuff like that. I'm still kind of back and forth, but right now I use that as broadcast only. And then if people want to interact, they can go to the other spots.
Yeah, awesome. And we'll put all of that information there in the show notes, robbwolf.com. That's Rob with 2 B's, you guys, if you're searching that. Be sure to check this guy out. Read some of the books that we mentioned at the beginning. Check out the Healthy Rebellion Radio so you can find out from Rob and his team a little bit more information. Again, thank you guys for listening to this episode of The Code with special guest Robb Wolf. Rob, thank you for your time and being on here. I hope you have an awesome rest of your Thursday, and we'll hopefully talk to you again soon.